After surviving the console wars of the 1990s,
The Bit War veterans are invading your podcast
to bring you gaming intel.
and old tales.
Together, we are your hosts, Max Inventory,
And Meow Tay Ching.
and we are the Bit War Veterans. We hope you all had a wonderful Thanksgiving. I know we sure did. Our first Thanksgiving away from home.
Overseas with our military family.
We've definitely made some good friends, who some are hopefully listening now.
And we definitely ate some good food. But this episode is all about, sadly, a dying medium in the video game industry. And that is video game strategy guides.
What happened?
Unfortunately, Prima, which is pretty much the sole survivor in the video game strategy guide industry, has announced that as a company, they'll be going under very soon. I don't think they're going to exist past 2019. Unfortunately, sluggish sales and the internet, being the biggest competitor to video game strategy guides, has beat them out this year.
I mean, how can a written guide compete with YouTube to provide visual walkthroughs, which is better than reading on a page of what you're supposed to do?
And it's all free.
I know, it's terrible. So in this episode, we're going to go back in time a little bit and talk about what life was like just before the beginning of strategy guides.
And what helped them rise to power? Nintendo power.
Oh my goodness. But we asked you on Twitter.
What were some of the game guides that you owned? What were some of your memories of the old game guides you had? And what did they mean to you?
So let's get right into a brief history of strategy guides. So before we really get into strategy guides coming out as complete compendiums or guidebooks, the closest thing we were having to that was like the gamer tips and tricks sections of magazines out at the time.
Yeah, sometimes readers would submit their tips and tricks, magazines would publish cheat codes and level pass codes, and for the time being, that was the only kind of guides that you had.
I think some of those probably came from the companies too. You know how some codes are like so elaborate and outlandish. There's like, I don't believe that people actually figured some of these out. I think they would slowly dole them out to just, keep up hype for the game, advertise the game. Especially when it came to like move lists for fighting games and that.
Conspiracy.
Yeah, I believe it.
And this was also a time where you would have 1-800 tip lines where you could call in and ask for tips, ask for guidance to get you around a certain level, and charge mommy and daddy's credit card by the minute.
I never used one of these things, and I cannot believe that people actually did.
I don't think I ever called in asking for help, although I did prank it one time.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it was so good. I think I was trying to prank it saying my Nintendo 64 was gonna explode or something. I don't really remember, and it was really obvious the guy knew I was pranking him, but he was very professional and walked me through some steps.
Did you make sure the Nintendo is plugged into the wall?
It was an American guy.
Oh, well. This really was the past.
Yes. Now, there was one very rare example of an arcade game that had its own strategy guide printed. The Pigskin Player's Handbook. It was published in 1990, and as far as I know, that's the only time an arcade game, and the manufacturers of that arcade game, publishing a book dedicated to strategy and tips about that one arcade game.
Pigskin 621 AD, an arcade game from Bally Midway in 1990.
You could play kind of a American football or rugby style game, but it's in the Middle Ages, so you're playing as like knights and peasants and Vikings, and it's really silly. Like, you could punch people and beat people up, and people are getting lit on fire on the field, and there's lakes and hazards and ditches you could fall into.
Eventually, this also came out on Sega Genesis, called Pigskin Foot Brawl.
Brawl is a good word to use for this game. Definitely a brawling kind of football game.
But if you know of any other arcade-style guidebooks out there, let us know.
We really don't hear of video game guidebooks until Nintendo Power gets popular. So in the 80s and 90s, at its height, over 1.5 million Americans were subscribed. Wow.
I was not one of those, but my friend was. So I just read all his.
So the very first player's guide was simply called The Official Nintendo's Player's Guide. And it featured a bunch of different tips and tricks from games, some from Legend of Zelda, Super Mario Bros., Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, Metroid, Kid Icarus, Castlevania, and a bunch more.
And at that time, Nintendo Power was just bi-monthly, so their plan was to release 6 strategy guides in the off months under the title of Nintendo Power Strategy Guides.
They only ended up making 4 that year because there was a lack of really big game titles that year. But they did release one for Super Mario Bros. 3, Ninja Gaiden 2, Final Fantasy, and a 4th one called 4-Player Extra, which covered a bunch of different 4-player games on the NES.
It was probably all the 4-player games on NES.
Right. And after those 4, they didn't do any more of those particular strategy guides until 1991.
They finally flipped to being monthly magazine and introduced their mainstay Player's Guides, which were offered as a free gift to new subscribers or for people renewing their subscriptions. They had the NES Game Atlas, I remember those, Game Boy Guides, Mario Mania, Super NES Guide.
Eventually, Nintendo Power made these available to buy in video game stores, or you could buy them separately by mail order, but at first you could only get them if you subscribed.
And after those, they came out with a 5th one released to subscribers called Top Secret Passwords, containing passwords for a wide variety of NES, SNES, and Game Boy games. After a while of being a subscriber exclusive, though, the guide was eventually sold to retailers, too. But I know we always went to Nintendo Power for a lot of advice. You know, many games, they had, like, fold-out posters of the whole maps of levels or worlds, depending on what kind of game it was. Nintendo Power was some top-notch stuff back in the day.
There were some games that you really couldn't beat without Nintendo Power, I swear.
That's true. I think, didn't the nerd cover some of that?
Yes, the angry video game nerd with Castlevania 2 and the tornado.
Yeah, there was some of that stuff, you know, there was no way you were going to get past, you know, some of the odd
obstacles. And
yeah.
Just, you know how cryptic they were back then. I guess they figured people had more time. I don't know. But when Nintendo Power started releasing their guides in 1990, a man named Russell DeMaria, senior editor for PC Gaming Magazine and a staff writer for GamePro, he was contracted with another man called Ben Dominitz. And they were contracted to create 5 video game strategy guide books. Their first one was called Nintendo Game Secrets, a whopping 358 pages. Whew. It had tips and codes for some of the most popular NES games. And then the other 4 they released were Sega Genesis Game Secrets, TurboGrafx Game Secrets, Game Boy Secrets.
We're seeing a pattern with those titles there.
And the official Lucasfilm Games Air Combat Strategy book. And this begins the era of video game strategy guides. So these guides were written with, of course, all the information that people would want to know about levels, but it also was written kind of in an entertaining tone with humor and, you know, bits of narrative. Some of them had, you know, pictures and extra little goodies, so it gave people a reason to buy and read these books. So Ben Dominitz, who founded Prima, was learning very quickly that these guides were selling well, there was a demand, and then he thought, you know, instead of doing these guide books, like these big compendiums, they could do one book for every game.
Which also was appropriate as games became larger and more, you know, complex
and more profitable. Hey.
Of course. So what does it take to make one of these guides? I remember I used to think in the magazines and the guides, like, how on earth did they get pictures of the games? I had no idea how this was done. I guess back in the day, they used, like, shutters around a TV screen and had, like, a certain camera setup that would, you know.
First, you need to acquire your licenses.
Oh, that's true. If you wanted to have that nice official label on your book.
So if you were a company that wanted to produce a strategy guide, you would have to think first off, okay, what guides are going to be popular and effective? And the best place that they would get this information from was from the game distribution companies themselves.
You don't have internet metadata at this time, so how could you know what consumers want?
Right, so you would have to contact the game makers directly to see what their sales numbers were and projected numbers for games that were not yet released. And Prima soon learned that if you couldn't get the official licensing and rights to make a game guide, it probably wasn't worth doing. Whoever got those rights and put that book on the shelf first was king.
They even had to fight Nintendo in court and prove that it's legal to release unauthorized strategy guides.
So some of this information comes from an anonymous ex-Prima staffer who was interviewed by Penny Arcade. They said that the real competition for game strategy guides happened in the boardroom and on conference calls.
Quote, whichever of the big publishers can tie up the official rights to a game basically decides whose guide will be on the shelves. With a few rare exceptions, almost all contacts for first-party strategy guides are exclusive within a single market. Publishers offer big bucks to game distributors for rights to be the only official guide available. Quote,
so the game publisher and authors of these strategy guides, they get a cash advance and royalties from book sales, and they also get the rights to inspect the book before it's printed. The publisher gets the right to say official on their game guides, and they could also use official artwork and things like that.
Probably goes a long way with advertisement and promotion. You've also got like the bundles, bundle the guide with the game if you pre-order or, things like that.
And it also looks very good to booksellers.
Oh, of course.
They want the official stuff on their shelves. So once the licenses and contracts are all drawn, then writing the game guide begins. So some of this information comes from an interview with David Hodgson, who was an author at Prima.
As you can imagine, these things take months to put together, even longer as games started expanding in their scale. It could even take up to 6 months of work to complete. And think about that, they have to get probably a version of the game that's not even 100% finished before it comes out for them to start working on this guide.
That's why being official really helps, because if you're contracted with a certain game company, you could get pre-release builds of your game, and if you were unofficial, you had to wait for everything to come out to then start making your guide. So of course, these authors of game guides have to play everything, explore every corner of the game, map everything out, and review all of this information.
This also means changes could be made to the final release version before it comes out when you think you've already got your guide finished.
In the 1990s, these game guide authors would play through the game, map everything out, and draw out the game world maps and the level maps by hand on graph paper, and then they would hand it over to the graphic design team. Later on, after computers and screenshots and scanning became available, they would fly over the game maps in debug modes if they had access to that. They would do multiple passes, taking screenshots, and then they would hand it to designers to piece everything all together.
So once they get a fix on the exterior and interiors of maps and buildings or levels, the rough versions based on screenshots are sent to the design team. This can take a couple of weeks, and then they can finally begin writing. Once the writing begins, they start cataloging everything, sorting and describing every weapon, swords, armors, potions, items, blueprints, materials, whatever you have in games, enemies, characters, bestiaries.
Yeah, spells, combos, every single quest, mission, secret treasures, objectives.
You know how thorough a good game guide can be.
They would even have to talk about certain tactics for defeating enemies, bosses, even secrets.
And then, of course, you pretty much need either screenshots or some type of artwork to go along with all of it. It used to blow me away, particularly in the Final Fantasy guidebooks, how they would have every enemy character, where it's found, what its weaknesses were, what kind of items it could drop, what kind of items you could steal from it. It's amazing how much information these people put together.
And then after all the information is put together, you have to review and recheck it, and sometimes even rewrite it after these game guide makers receive newer builds of the game. So since these game guide makers don't have the final release version of the game while they're writing everything, sometimes game guides actually go to print with inaccurate information or missing information due to some of the changes that are made to the final version of the game. And in one extreme example, there was a game guide written for a Dreamcast version of Half-Life. It was printed and published, and then at the last minute, the Dreamcast version got canceled. Wow.
That's pretty wild.
I think it was, the Dreamcast was definitely a failure at that
near
point.
Near the end?
Yeah.
I mean, Half-Life probably would have been pretty good on the Dreamcast.
It was probably when Sega was canceling everything Dreamcast left and right.
Yeah, so sad. But then, of course, as the internet started to become more popular, some of these companies started introducing that component to their guides. And they would tell you to go to their website, maybe enter a code or whatever, and then you can get an update.
So, of course, Prima was kind of the big dog in video game guide companies, but there were many others that existed throughout the 90s and early to mid 2000s. That's when we saw most of these companies printing things.
I, for one, bought, I think, quite a few guidebooks by Brady Games.
Yeah, I had a few too.
I think for a while they were the ones really putting out the official Squaresoft strategy guides, or at least for Final Fantasy.
Yes, Prima messed up, and we'll get into that very soon.
But Brady Games was put together around 1993, published their first strategy guide as a division of Macmillan Computer Publishing, and at their height they published 90 to 100 guides per year. They were definitely Prima's biggest competitor, and they produced many official Sega guides as well as official World of Warcraft guides. I had the official World of Warcraft guide. I didn't know anything about MMOs before I started playing World of Warcraft.
No, and it got tricky because after every update and patch, things could change.
Yes, and they did have expanded material. You could go to their website and they would let you print it off, and like you could put it in a binder and keep it with it and all that.
And it's very important to notice, later on, Brady Games would operate under Dorland Kinserly imprint. This is very important for the history, so remember that.
Dorland Kinserly.
Another game guide company was Cybex Incorporated. It actually began in 1976, not as a game guide company, but as an educational company that would print books all about how to do certain things on computers, programming languages, and stuff like that. It was published and started in Berkeley, California, and Paris, France. So they started making game guides in the 90s and early 2000s, and they focused mainly on the PC market, and they released internationally as well. But as of today, they don't produce guides any longer. I really couldn't find guides from them after, the mid-2000s. I don't know exactly when they stopped making guides, but they still continue to publish educational material.
Cybex sounds like a robot factory or something. Piggyback was another company founded almost 20 years ago, and they published guides for the international markets in UK, Australia, New Zealand, France, Germany, Italy, Spain, the Nordic territories, Austria, Switzerland, and even a little bit in North and South America. Now they had partnerships with Capcom, Disney Interactive, Konami, Nintendo, Sony, Square Enix, and Ubisoft. And they still produce a few guides to this day. Now, another one I used to buy and had a subscription to was Game Fan, a monthly magazine started by Tim Lindquist and Dave Haverson in September 1992. The magazine had game reviews, humorous articles, they had fantastic art, really high production quality, I thought. It had like the thicker spine, it wasn't the thin, rounded staple spine, and beautiful pictures, thick pages. I loved Game Fan magazine. They also put out a lot of information of what was going on in Japan and in the Japanese gaming market, which not everyone really did back then.
And it really helped when, there was a popularity and rise of like manga and anime in the United States. Like, that was kind of your go-to magazine.
Now, I don't remember exact prices, but let's say your average magazine was around $3.50. Game Fan was like $5. So you did pay more for the quality, but I had subscriptions on and off to them. I loved it. I love their guides. And there are still a couple of websites you can go to where you can find scans of old magazines like Retro Mags or archive.org or retrocdn.net. And if you're interested, I think you would really like this magazine. Sadly, their last issue was December of 2000 due to a number of lawsuits which eventually prevented the printing and distribution of the magazine. I'm not sure what the details of those lawsuits are, but I know some of the OG creators or writers went on and made a magazine, I think called Next Gen, something like that.
And then we had Versus books. So they started publishing game guides in the mid-90s, and they were kind of like the alternative to Prima and Brady. And they were known for their perfect guides. That's what they said on the covers of a lot of them. So they would write in like a really humorous kind of a narrative, and they had a lot of really detailed charts and cheat codes, and some of them even came with posters in their books. I bought a Ocarina of Time Versus strategy book just for the posters, but I'm glad I bought it because that was actually the best guide I had for that game. I also had a Prima guide for that. Prima didn't even come close to the quality that Versus books had, because they had big artwork, they had a lot of details, and one of the things is that most of their guides were unofficial. Which meant that they would do their guides after the game came out, but it kind of gave them a little bit of the upper hand because they were able to get feedback from players and know exactly what the players wanted in the guides, and they catered to that. Unfortunately, Versus books quietly folded sometime around 2003. But unofficial guides had certain qualities to them that could be good, and they also had some bad things in the legality front.
That anonymous ex-Prima employee says that, quote, being official is mandatory. You need early copies of the game to play in order to write the guide if you're hoping to release next to the game itself, which is necessary to get your sales. You need licensed art and images to grab the customer's eye on the store shelves. And there's limited shelf space, so retailers will put one version of the strategy guide on the counter next to copies of the game. They're always going to pick the official guide. If you're not official, you're nothing. End quote.
If you risk writing an unofficial guide, sometimes companies could hold a grudge. Now, at one point, Prima merely suggested that they would produce an unofficial Final Fantasy VII guide, and that soured the company's relationship with Square so much that for a while, Prima needed to partner with the European Piggyback to distribute some of their guides in the United States. I guess you could say Piggyback was Prima's piggyback for a while.
They were piggybacking on piggyback.
Yeah.
But then, of course, as the internet has become more accessible and ubiquitous in people's homes, game guides were facing a whole new competitor. Prima thought they were ready for it, and they had a lot of ideas to benefit from the digital age. They thought about releasing electronic guides with interactive maps and narrated videos with built-in community tools. I don't know if they really did that, but...
No.
They never really executed that, huh?
We will find out why very soon.
But this was before broadband, so their idea was then to release it on CD-ROMs. They also considered a strategy marketplace where you could kind of crowdsource strategy guides with community members voting on their favorite writers, sort of like what we have with GameFAQs.com. They also tried producing ebooks before, the Kindle was around, complete with multimedia content, and to focus on downloads so they weren't as beholden to the retail chain.
But according to this ex-Prima employee, quote, none of these came to pass, at least not in the way originally envisioned, and they were all stopped dead in their tracks by one thing: licensing. Every tiny thing has to be approved by the company once you're an official licenser. Prima has terabytes of content that it could make available, but they can't do anything with it without getting written authorization. Prima's electronic books were basically the printed book in PDF form, with no modifications. Why? Because even a single paragraph change had to go through the game publisher and the game publisher's lawyer for their stamp of approval.
Jeez Louise, man.
So it seems like licensing and the legal process really put a hamper on Prima's visions in the digital age. The source said that game companies stopped almost all form of innovation at Prima. Quote, online communities? Prima embraced them, even starting a rudimentary fan site building program. Game companies hated it. They wanted the community on their sites, not other places.
Oh, of course.
Whether or not the venture was profitable, the game company needed their cut, or it was nixed. It got to the point that new ideas were just dismissed because it wasn't worth the effort to even ask for permission. Both Brady Games and Prima are far more book companies than they are game companies. I don't know anything about the management of Brady Games, but none of the Prima or Random House executives are gamers.
That I believe. He must truly be an insider.
Yes.
I mean, how could one even guess that?
So he continues. There are certainly gamers on the staff, but decisions are made based on likely sales and costs, not game quality or nostalgia, and that's probably for the best, considering the low profit margin in the industry. Every so often, you see a push towards trying to get more involvement in the gamer community or becoming a more respected brand with that group, but the realities of the strategy guide publishing work against them. Maybe Prima Games and some of these other companies would still be around today if they had the wiggle room to do what they wanted when the internet was in its infancy, because, I mean, think about it. Crowdsourcing, video game information, interactive maps, videos, that's stuff that we have today in forms of like YouTube and forums and things like that.
Yeah, and like I mentioned, GameFAQs
GameFAQs,
did
yes.
it. And, they're not anything.
They're free.
They pioneered that. It's got to be one of the oldest game cheat websites out there. I mean, I was using it back when probably Final Fantasy VII was out.
I remember the very first time I used the internet. It was at public library, and the first thing I looked up was cheat codes for video games. I mean, that just proves.
I don't know if it was GameFAQs, but somewhere online, before Final Fantasy VII released in America, I had found a site where fans had translated the whole script for the game, and I printed it out. And we took a trip to see my uncle in California, and I brought that script with me, and I read the whole script for the game before it came out here in America.
And that's what the game companies didn't want you to do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Too bad, so sad.
So other game companies tried to innovate ideas. So in 2005, IGN and Prima signed on an agreement for the Direct-to-Drive digital retail store that offered downloadable versions of Prima guides for computer and console games. Did you ever download any of them?
No.
No, me neither. Once again, I think by that time I was just looking up things on GameFAQs for the most part.
I think the last actual guide I got with a game was like Mass Effect 3.
And then we also had Square Enix. They had their Play Online guide, but it was not very good, and I'll tell you why. So Square Enix, when they published their Final Fantasy IX guide, they decided to be all innovative and stuff, and they included what they called the Play Online guide. Unfortunately, a lot of people didn't like it because in the game guide, it would give you just a short little paragraph or just a couple sentences about a certain, an item, a character, a level, something you had to do. And then next to it, it would have a code. So you would have to go online to their Play Online client, which if you ever had to use that, it was a nightmare. I hated that thing. So you would enter in the specific code, and then you could get a more detailed version of that, whatever you were looking up. But it made the guide look really bad because the guide was really thin, didn't have much info in it, and it was just all these ugly codes on the side of the page.
And why would I want to stop playing the game, look at the book, then go to a computer, plug in that crap, look it up?
Right.
Probably figure out what you were trying to look up by then.
Yeah, I didn't like using it at all. And the fact that they wanted everyone else to use it to get more in-depth information in their guides, it did not work. Luckily, in guides in the future, they didn't include all these Play Online codes, but that was their little experiment that did not work out. The rise of the internet led to the shrinking and consolidation of game guide companies.
So now, after the internet has been around and kind of breaking up how we look up game tips and tricks, cheat codes and whatnot, some of these companies started to really suffer and feel the burn. Started closing their doors or consolidating into other companies. That good old Dorling Kindersley, remember them? They published the Brady games. They were purchased by Penguin Books in 1999 after almost completely folding due to printing too many Star Wars novels that did not sell well.
In 2001, Prima was purchased by Random House.
In 2007, Nintendo Power announced they would no longer be publishing strategy guides, and they appointed Prima Games as the officially endorsed publisher of licensed strategy guides. Good deal for them. And I think Nintendo Power stopped being a printed magazine not too long after that. Also in 2009, Prima Games decided to take the expert strategy concept an additional step. First, they hired The Syndicate, which was their own independent studio, in place of a specific author. The guides would be written from the ground up solely by The Syndicate. So they were the writers, the authors, the project managers, the editors, all in that team there. Then the scope of the guides they worked on was expanded to include more first-person shooters, real-time strategies, and RPG games.
In 2010, Prima made the move of selling their strategy guides digitally on Steam.
That's funny. I don't remember ever seeing that.
I mean, it sounds like a good move, but I just don't think it worked out for them quite well because 3 years later, Prima's parent company, Penguin, merged with Random House. And Random House, of course, now owned Brady Games. So that merger created Penguin Random House.
Random Penguin House. I don't think they like that.
And then just 2 years after that, since both Prima and Brady were under one umbrella corporation, they merged together under the name Prima. So Brady Games, after 2015, was no more, gobbled up by hungry Penguin Random House.
Instead of Prima and Brady, we now have Prima Brady.
Just Prima.
Yeah, no, they're Prima Games.
And by 2015, I don't think hardly anyone else was publishing guides. You know, Versus was out of the picture, Game Fan was out of the picture. I think Piggyback is kind of the only one that still does things now.
Yeah.
And it was pretty apparent by that time that sales were struggling.
According to Douglas Walsh, another longtime strategy guide author, he says that the statistics about strategy guide sales are very closely guarded info. Quote, "As you can imagine, the sales today have consolidated around a few big hits. Skyrim, Grand Theft Auto, things like that. Sales have also dropped off considerably, especially for shooters. The Call of Duty and Gears of War books sell a fraction of the copies they used to. But a big hit, especially as a limited edition hardcover, can crack Amazon's top 25. Game books in particular, like Skyrim and Grand Theft Auto, have even cracked the top 5.
Despite the occasional success, the number of game guides produced every single year is down with sales. There's only about 60 game guides made every year, and that's half of what the figure was in the PlayStation 2 era. And very soon, I don't think there's going to be any more physical copies produced every year. So next we have the concept of the tail. So the tail refers to how long a product will sell. So if you're producing something, it's good to have a long tail. But unfortunately, in this day and age, strategy guides have no tail. So if you don't sell your inventory within a day or two, you're going to sit on it forever. And this is especially true with bigger games that are more likely to feature a strategy guide. Once the game has been out for like a week or two, and then the internet is filled with good free strategy guides and tips, the tail is gone.
Great example of this right now is Red Dead Redemption 2. You've got everybody and their mother making how-to and tips and whatnot videos on YouTube.
Within the first day or two of having Red Dead Redemption 2, I was looking up on YouTube how to do certain things, and I did use a couple of game websites that had kind of like consolidated guides. But I was not thinking about going to a store and buying a book about it.
No. There's also this wonderful rdr2map.com site where players can update where they find items or animals, pretty much anything of interest on the map.
And that's what Prima wanted to do, 10 years ago,
Ding, ding,
even
ding.
before that. But unfortunately, Maybe that was a downside of being an officially licensed source. You had to go through all these legal hoops. So some facts and figures. If you don't have the game guide on the shelf when the game is launched, you can expect to lose about 50 to 60% in sales, and that number can go as high as 90% if it's not available in the first week. They sell more like magazines than traditional books. Now, in the past, Prima tried to re-release game guides for older games with their Value series, but it proved to be a financial failure.
So basically there's that little narrow sweet spot where the game is still really popular, but also before you get a whole bunch of yahoos on the internet putting out their own video guides or written guides.
For free.
For free!
Just recently, Prima announced the very sad news that they will be ceasing operations in spring 2019.
They had offices all over America, New York, Indianapolis, Roseville, California, and unfortunately they're going to be affected by the close of this company.
Roseville is expected to close this month. I guess that means November, maybe December, right before the holidays. That's tough. And the New York office will shut down in March. I don't have any info about the Indianapolis office.
And it seems their last 2 guides coming out will be for Pokemon Let's Go Pikachu and Super Smash Bros. Ultimate, which either one are probably going to be decent games to have a guide for. There are going to be so many unlockables in Smash Bros. Ultimate, and I'm sure Let's Go Pikachu will have a fair amount of content.
Right. I know they had their official Pokemon guide, I think it was for Platinum, and that guide was like this giant hardcover book that had like everybody's everything, and it was like 600 something pages, so I mean, they do put a lot of effort into their Pokemon guides, and it's kind of sad to see them go. So their CEO, Ian Hudson, who is the parent of Dorling Kinserly, put out this statement. During a year-long extensive review, many new ways were explored to diversify Prima Games publishing. However, the dynamics for us of this fast-paced landscape have continued to prove difficult. This enormously dedicated team has made every effort to turn the business around, but challenging market conditions have unfortunately worked against them.
So strategy guides are going to be a collector's item, I think. Think of how expensive an Earthbound complete in box with the strategy guide is.
I believe the Versus Final Fantasy VII guide will sell for like over $100 on eBay right now.
I wish I had my Brady Games guide still, just because I used to love looking at it, but yeah, I looked at it so much, the covers fell off, pages were coming out.
Whew. You know, it's kind of sad to think that these game guides used to be absolutely used by everyone, and then in more recent years, they kind of acted as collector's items. You know, the big, fancy, hardcover books were the ones that really sold.
And there'll still be a place for them, I think. One of the real reasons we bought the guide for Zelda Breath of the Wild is because of the artwork it's full of.
We bought the collector's edition, and, you know, if it was just a regular soft cover edition, I don't think I would have bought it. But
No, but this is a work of art.
So that brings up a good point. Is there still room for big collector's guides in the game market, or, you know, is this it for, you know, printing game publications?
I almost bought one for Mario Odyssey.
A big hardcover one, like a collector's one?
Yeah.
It's for the artwork and things?
That, and because the game does have a lot to it.
But that's information you could just find online. So why did you want the guide?
Because in a game like Mario Odyssey, you don't necessarily need to rely on video, I think, on how to get certain things. Sometimes just having a map with locations marked on it is a little simpler.
Are you the kind of guy that likes to flip through pages? You like that physical?
And that too.
You like that?
Yeah.
You like the way they smell? I like the way they smell.
Yeah, you know. You got to have something to read while you poop, right?
So is that it? Game guides are just poop material now?
A quality bathroom read.
Well, you're not taking that Zelda guide in the bathroom.
Okay, I promise.
Okay.
Too busy watching Red Dead videos. And now we're moving on to the Twitter segment, where we get to have a internet conversation with you, the listener.
You could help us tell the tale of the Bit Wars. of the age of strategy guides.
And our question was, with the passing of Prima, it feels like the era of game strategy guides are over. What were some of the guides you owned? What were your memories of the old guides you had? What did they mean to you? Here are your answers.
We have Punk Rock Bob. He used to use them as a tome to the games he was loving. He said, I hardly ever used them for advice, sometimes for collectible lists. I do remember Final Fantasy VII being glorious until, oh hey, here's pictures of Ares being stabbed to death. We don't want you to miss this part.
Spoilers, man.
So I had a question I wanted to ask you, because I think I don't have any specific memories of this, but I think I've done it before in the past. Like, when you were at a bookstore, did you ever just pick up a guide to a game to find out what happens in the game?
Yeah, sometimes, or maybe I just needed help with one little thing, and I didn't, have money to get the whole guide. I don't remember who made it, but there was this awesome Metal Gear Solid guide, and I remember going specifically to look at in Kmart whenever my mom would drag me there to shop.
Oh, Kmart.
And I used to love it because it had like a whole section in the beginning, I think, where it talked about the real technologies of Metal Gear and all the real elements that were integrated into Metal Gear. Or, brief little blurb on DARPA. It talked about drones back then. Some of the weapons and the tech and gadgets involved in it. I used to love that thing. But I couldn't get everything I wanted back then.
Of course. Now, I remember having a Majora's Mask strategy guide, and the very end section, the pages were like perforated together. So you would have to buy the guide, of course, and then you could rip open the ending pages very carefully. And in that last section, they covered, I believe it was like getting the deity mask, and then it had the story conclusions for like after you beat the game and how to kind of get some of those extra masks and how some things end up, on the third day. I thought that was really neat. Like, even if you were to pick up the guide in the store, the ending wouldn't be spoiled because those pages were stuck together until you ripped over the little perforated
that's kind of weird.
Yeah, it was, but that's kind of smart because then you wouldn't end up like Punk Rock Bob being spoiled.
Yeah, I guess so. Oh, and I hated it when they'd be wrapped in plastic and then look for one that was, already ripped open. Like, wait for some other person to rip it open, and then I just read that one.
Did you ever rip one open yourself?
I might have. If I did, I don't remember what it was.
We have a tweet from Kevin Harbin. He remembers the issue of GamePro that had a section dedicated to all the special fatalities from Mortal Kombat. He said that was pretty cool.
Yeah, especially Mortal Kombat 2 when they were introducing multiple fatalities, babalities, friendships, all those things, man. You needed a guide. There's no way you could figure that stuff out.
Really. And then, during that time, you would have people with rumors like, there's a cheat code that lets you see people naked. Just people came up with weird stuff.
Yeah, there was the magazine, it might have been GamePro, that put out that April Fool's joke where there was that cheat code to make Lara Croft naked in Tomb Raider.
How many people went home and tried that?
And they even photoshopped the image, yeah. At Pieces of Bits says, I still have most of my Prima guides I purchased since the late 90s. They were the best pre-internet way of getting through tough spots in games. Thankfully, Prima left enough out of them so it wasn't complete hand-holding. That's a good mark of a game guide. You don't necessarily want it to, have every little direction you need to make. Show where the important things are, show where some of the hidden things are, or tell you, hey, to check this area out for a special cutscene or something like that.
I remember I bought an Ocarina of Time guide from Prima, and I also own the one from Versus, and I believe in the Water Temple section, I think Prima had a little bit of a wrong info for a certain room, and then I had to go use my Versus book to double check, and they had the right thing printed. I remember that.
Well, now we know why. Versus got the final build of the game. At Cecil234 says, such a sad state of affairs. Wait, thought Brady Games was a separate company. That aside, I have so many guides on my shelf. 10 to 20 years from now, I wonder if guides will be worth anything. That said, I'm off to half-price books to get some more.
So when I worked at GameStop, we had this little thing. It would only happen maybe like once a year. It was very rare, but it was called pennying out the game guides. And we would just randomly get an email from corporate one day, and they would be like, if you have, this and this and this game guide in the store, they would have a list to immediately print new price tags for them. And the games would be literally only pennies. It was a way for them to like liquidate their sales. So you could get a lot of game guides for a penny. Or, just $1 or $2.
It's a great way to go. Back when we live at home in the States, there's a nice little chain of retro game and video store.
Disc Replay.
And they have a nice little section of old magazines and game guides. I think when we visit back home, I might have to hit that up.
If there's any left.
The store is even there. I don't know.
Oh, the store seems to be
I've been
doing
gone for
fine.
almost a whole year. I'm sorry. I've been gone for more than a year. Holy cow.
Norrin Red III. He said he owns and still has many of the game guides and still likes to use them in playthroughs when he can. He loves the old unofficial Final Fantasy VII, Suikoden, and Resident Evil guides. That's where I found out about this cool camera angle with Barry Burton and his 1996 textured beard.
He posts that awesome gif of Barry walking in front of the camera and just turning his head all funny. I don't know why that makes me smile.
So then I asked him, hey, were those the Versus book guides? Because, that kind of rang a bell with me. I really love Versus. And he said yes! Resident Evil and Final Fantasy VII ones were. Awesome full-color original art. Final Fantasy VII came with a sweet giant poster. So then he went into his storage room and took pictures for us. By the way, Norrin Red III, very, very cool. He has the Resident Evil 1 guide from Dimension. He doesn't remember seeing any other guides by them. And I actually tried to look up that company, and I really couldn't find much about Dimension. So I don't know if that was just a one-hit wonder from them. I don't really know. But
I remember that Tekken 3 Versus guide. I think I've seen that Resident Evil guide, but I never had it or knew anyone who had it. Of course, the Versus Resident Evil guide. And then we see some Brady Games guides for Xenosaga. Those are some pretty big games. Not a bad game to have a guide for. Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time 3D. Yep, Prima official game guide.
See a Metal Gear game guide. Hey, was that the one that you would look through?
That might be. God, I wish I could teleport over there and flip through that.
He had a Dragon Ball Z game guide. I
He's
see
got some good stacks here.
I see that unofficial Final Fantasy VII guide. By the way, do not let these game guides go. Some of these are actually worth quite a bit of money now, so take good care of them.
At Trashylvania says, I love the guide for Final Fantasy VIII, using it for the entire game, and then was sorely disappointed by Nines that just kept telling you to visit a website for the real info. At Caleb Mickle responded, Nines strategy guide is the absolute worst I've ever used. It wasn't even a real guide. Go to theplayonline.com to learn more.
Yeah, and that's the one we talked about earlier. The failed square experiment.
Yeah, trash.
So Leo Hightower Jr. says, I got a few guides of my own. I'll take a pic later. And then later on, he actually did take a picture for us. He says, it ain't much, but here they are. Sonic Adventure 1 guide has a slight tear at the end. Oh no.
Whoa.
So what I see here, we have a Dark Cloud 2, Super Smash Bros., Kirby 64, The Crystal Shards, Mega Man X7, Super Mario Sunshine, a big old Twilight Princess guide, the Premier Edition, Pokemon Snap, Golden Sun and Golden Sun The Lost Age, Sonic Adventure 2, Final Fantasy Chronicles, Sonic Adventure, Metroid Prime, Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, and Metroid Zero Mission. That's a pretty good collection.
Did Kirby 64 really need a strategy guide? Is that
The fact is, it's kind of a thicker guide too. Like,
yeah.
Okay, like the Pokemon Snap guide he has looks like a magazine. Like, that's how thin it is.
Yeah.
And then Kirby 64 is like 2 or 3 times the size of that, which, yeah, that is weird.
I wonder if that Ocarina of Time guide is the one that I had. So I didn't have a 64 growing up. Friend did. I think it actually came out around this time. I think I even saw a post on Twitter somebody made that Ocarina of Time came out like 20 years ago today. Or a few days ago. So he he and his family were going away for Thanksgiving, so I made a deal with him that if I bought the guide, he'd let me borrow the N64 and Ocarina of Time while he was gone. As much as I wanted to not use a guide for the game, I only had a short window of time to be able to play through it, so it was pretty fun being able to borrow that and then use the guide and go through it as fast as I possibly could. At Lakakalo says, being something of a tech enthusiast and a cheap bastard, I generally turn to game FAQs for all my gaming guidance needs.
Good old game facts. You know what? You put them out of business. You put Prima out of business with
Shame.
that. Shame. No. Seriously, I use them too all the time. I mean,
yeah, but
we're all guilty.
Seeing somebody's little ASCII drawing of a outline of a map, go this way and go here. Yeah, that sucked. It was never going to be as good as screenshots. At producer BTW says, I grew up with them. End of an era. At Game Changer DOC says, I used to buy the Prima guides for all open worlds and RPGs. Some of the ones I loved the most were Ocarina of Time, Final Fantasy X, and Kingdom Hearts. Well, and I agree. Larger games, I would buy them only for those, particularly RPGs, just to make sure I got everything that you could possibly get, Yeah. I didn't want to miss a beat.
I borrowed someone's Fallout 3 guide, and that was really helpful because there's so much stuff in that game that you could miss. A lot of side quests, a lot of not even side quests, just little random thingies that you could find on the map. And it was really great to just be able to flip through and say, got it. Oh, I need to do this.
Yeah, and I think that started because my buddy had Final Fantasy 6/3, and he had a guide for that. And, that game was so massive, and you had 2 hidden characters. And then when we played Final Fantasy 4/2, we didn't have a guide for it, so we always felt like we were missing out on things.
At Olios, or is it Zeros? I only own one Prima guide, Zelda Skyward Sword, but I borrowed several from the library for other games like Metroid Prime Trilogy, Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2, and Mario Kart Wii. Mario Kart Wii in particular has some secret unlocks I didn't know until I read the guide. The Super Mario Galaxy guide helped me get through the infamous Luigi's Purple Coin level as well as the Fast Foe Comet levels and the Cosmic Luigi races. Gotta get those shortcuts down.
That makes sense. I don't think in my day they carried game guides at the library.
Yeah, it makes me wonder.
I mean, I go back now. These guys, they got mangas and freaking comic books and all kinds of stuff there. I was like, I never had this stuff when I was there.
Yeah, that is cool. Borrowing a game guide from your local library. That's a great way to get kids to use the resources. Yeah.
At Riot Blues 1990 says, only guide I own from Prima is the Final Fantasy Tactics one they released. Back when they were pretty useful, but I can see why people don't buy them now. And I think publishers know it because there are collector's edition guides, so they just try to market them as an extra collector's item. And he's got this really cool picture of that guide too, and I love how very big in the bottom corner it says, Secrets of the Battle System. Man, that game, it was like a mystery when it first came out.
So then Riot Blues 1990 kind of goes on a rant about these special collector's edition guides, especially the Dark Souls 3 Flask Edition. So he posted a picture of the flask by itself, and when I first saw this picture, I did not know what that was. It just looks like a green plastic thing. I thought it kind of looks like a construction earplug. I didn't know how big it was. There was nothing to show what size it was, but I'm like, why is he showing me this green earplug looking thing? No, that's the special edition flask that came with the guide.
Or like a little dog chew toy or something.
Or maybe something inappropriate. I don't know.
Well, I mean, the box looks nice, and the guide is a nice little hard book. You get a nice big map in it. I think there's some redeemable qualities there. And he also posted a YouTube video of somebody unboxing it. And I just want to say that person has some really strange looking thumbs. Just watch the video.
I guess this guide was, something like $100? And you get this cool little sword, but I guess it was real cheap. And this green flask that doesn't look like anything. Just a big hunk of stupid plastic. You get a nice box and an art book with it too, I guess. But Riot Blues is trying to make the point that game guides are probably going to go in the direction of just collector's junk.
Tat, as maybe our British partners would say.
Tat.
So, like, this case of this green flask, if they just made it like a useful actual flask or vessel, that might have helped, but...
Yeah, like, you can't put stuff in it. It's just...
No, and it's big!
It's just a big hunk of plastic.
It's big, and it looks stupid as hell. This is just...
Like, imagine paying $100 and getting that. Would you be happy? No. I'd say take this and stick it up your butt.
Probably not. I mean, $80.
$80.
$80. Because you'd have the game, the guide, which, around $20. Nice hardcover, artwork, stuff like that. Little sword, like, page holder or whatever the intent was with that. And then the flask you just laugh at and throw away.
Well, yeah. I mean, will we see more of this kind of junk? This tat in the future? I don't know. Mr. Coin Laundry, he says, I still have the strategy guides to Knights of the Old Republic 2, and I don't think I ever even used it to help me through the game. I just like looking at it and seeing what all was in the game without reading where I could find any of it.
Well, there you go. See, another fine bathroom read.
Was that his poop book?
At Winstolf, I have a Siphon Filter 2 guide, a Gran Turismo 4 guide, which is beautiful, and Final Fantasy 8 guide, and a Final Fantasy Tactics guide. Very nice. Very nice.
I wonder, does the Gran Turismo have just a lot of car pictures?
Probably does. I mean, stats on the cars, how to unlock them, I guess. What you need to earn the certain licenses, whatever. I haven't played a Gran Turismo game since number 2.
Yeah, same here.
And I can't imagine Siphon Filter really needing a guide. I think that might have been another problem with these companies. They made guides for, like, everything.
Right.
And not every game really needed a guide. Come on.
So thank you for your tweets. Thanks for sharing the guides that you own, telling the tale, keeps adding to the Bit War narrative, the things that we used to own and enjoy, and why we did the things we did. Once again, this is just like an era that kids today don't know about game guides and game magazines, so thanks for sharing your stories with us, because maybe one day they'll listen to this podcast and go, wow, things were sure different back then. So what about the game guides you used to own? Do you remember some of them?
I had a nice little stack, at least from the past. Like I mentioned, the Final Fantasy 3, Final Fantasy 7. I probably had a guides for 8 and 9 because I continued that trend. I had one for 10, and I even bought one for 13 when it came out. It's a nice guide. The guide's nicer than the game. I mean, oh, Lord. Oh, 13. When I originally played Mass Effect, I didn't have a guide for that, but I bought one later on. The reason I bought a guide for the first Mass Effect is if I was going to loan the game to somebody else to help them get through the game faster, instead of wasting a lot of time like I did looking for things that aren't really there.
When we first met and we were talking about video games and we learned that we both liked video games, you lent me Mass Effect and that guide for a while.
Yeah.
Is that what you used to hook in the ladies?
I guess so.
Oh, you hooked me. Oh, jeez.
Like, do this and play through this game quickly so you can get to the other two. And so you won't waste your time driving the Mako around empty planets for no reason. And I continued that trend, bought them for 2 and 3. But even at that point, and with Final Fantasy 13, I was buying them as part of pre-order packages in that. So I wasn't really like, oh, I need the guide.
Mm-hmm.
It was just a nice perk for adding 10 or $20 more. And then the last game, I think, was probably Mass Effect 3, and then Zelda Breath of the Wild. We bought that nice, beautiful hardback guide for that. And that was mainly just for artwork.
I'm thinking back to the guides I owned. I had a Brady game guide for Super Mario RPG, which sounds cool, but the guide was in black and white.
Yes! I wanted to bring that up. I would see black and white guides in the stores and it would make me angry. I'm like, why would you pay for this crap? half the time you couldn't see what was in the pictures. It looked disgusting.
The pictures were pretty blobby and
disgusting.
The fact of the matter is, it's cool that I have the Super Mario RPG guide, but the guide itself, not great pictures, and I felt it was a little bit lacking in stuff you could put in a guide, especially for a game that's like so big and colorful and so many enemies and things like that, and the guide felt a little lackluster, I'm not gonna lie.
That must have been unofficial, because I remember my friend had one.
So it looks like Nintendo had their player's guide.
Nintendo had the official one. That's the one my buddy had.
See, I had the black and white Brady Games one.
Oh, and this is a beautiful guide. I'm looking at a PDF of it right now.
Oh, so yeah, the Super Mario Legend of the Seven Stars says totally unauthorized.
Mm-hmm.
Ah.
I knew it. Gotta get those licenses, people.
And then, let's see, some of the other game guides I remember having was both the Prima and the Versus Ocarina of Time. And the Versus book was I loved that so much. I would take it with me on car trips and I would just read it. That was my entertainment, just reading the guide over and over again.
That's why my Final Fantasy VII book fell apart. Even that Resident Evil 2 one, I would go through a lot. Also to try and have stuff memorized to speedrun the game. You've got 2 different playthroughs with Leon and Claire. And they split the guide in half. They had Leon on the front cover, Claire on the rear cover, and you turned it upside down. It would go through it that way.
Oh, no, that's pretty cool. Now, I remember one time, I think I bought that game guide to school, and I was showing it off to people. Ocarina of Time guide. And then I came home from school, and one of my friends who had Ocarina of Time called me, and she was having trouble getting through one of the temples or whatever.
You were the tip line that didn't charge.
I was the tip line, and then, I gave her the tip. We hung up from each other, and then maybe 5 minutes later, she called me back, wanted to know how to get through the next thing, which, by the way, it wasn't difficult. It wasn't like the water temple, so I give her the tip. All right, and about another 5 minutes later, she calls back. And then at that point, maybe after 4 or 5 phone calls, my mom was getting angry. She's like, just tell her, figure it out on herself. You can't be giving her the...
Why is she getting mad?
Because...
She can't use the phone?
Well, yeah, because we only had one phone line.
Of course.
And my friend just kept calling every 5 minutes asking how to do the next part. And, I gotta be honest, it was not a tough part. I don't remember exactly what it was, but it was... I think you were still Kid Link, going through one of the first 3 temples to get the stones, these were not difficult, so I became the unofficial Nintendo hotline for a day. I also had a game guide for the original Pokemon Red Blue. I think there was some sort of, I don't know if it was official or not, but it was a guide about the Pokemon card game. I remember just for the first couple of sets, it had everything included, told you how to play, some strategies and stuff. When Pokemon was hot. Hot Pokemon. And then you talked about guides that you owned that you didn't really need a guide for, but you bought anyways. And for me, that was the very first Super Smash Bros. You really didn't need a guide for that game, but I had the guide because I liked the artwork. I think they need to bring back that kind of artwork, the noodle arm, cartoony looking characters that, the box art has. And I remember one thing in particular. It was the section for Board the Platforms. And in the game guide for Samus's section, and if you played the first Smash Brothers, I think you'll remember, there's that one platform that is so hard to get to. It's you have to jump with perfect precision. It's so far away. And even in the game guide, I don't think they were able to get it because the screenshot was them missing the platform.
Oh, really?
Yeah, and it says jump off of here, double jump, then use the up B move, and you will get oh so close. And the screenshot showed them missing the platform. And I mean, it took me a million tries. I eventually got it, but it just was kind of funny that did Prima not actually get that platform? And I know I owned a few more guides. I just can't remember off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, I had one for Chrono Cross when that came out. Because that was another one I was like, whoa, there's like 100 characters you can get in this game or something like that. It was massive.
And then what's kind of funny was before I moved here to Korea and I was going through all my things, deciding should I ship this, should I store this, etc., etc. I came across my game guides, and you could kind of see the evolution where I had game guides, and then underneath the game guides were printed pages from probably GameFAQs, and I had printed pages of cheat codes for Grand Theft Auto 3 and Vice City. So you could see the evolution happening before your eyes, where I had a lot of game guides for Super Nintendo, N64 era, and then as soon as the PlayStation 2 era hits, I'm just printing off stuff from the internet. And then after that, I think the next game guides I bought were maybe the collector's edition for Twilight Princess. So I guess that's the evolution, You buy the game magazines, like Nintendo Power, then you buy the game guides throughout the 90s and 2000s, and then you get the internet and you start printing things off for free, and then you become an adult and you have a little bit more money to spend, so you get the shiny, fancy collector's edition guide that you kind of look at, and it becomes your bathroom reader. And I guess that's what killed the industry.
Did you ever rent a video game and in the instruction manual, sometimes, most of the games would have blank pages in the back?
Yeah.
And somebody actually wrote codes?
I wish.
That happened a couple times for games. I don't remember which ones.
I always dreamed about that happening, but I never came across a person who wrote codes in the back. Amazing.
Well, you also didn't always get the book when you rented the game, too.
True. But I always wanted someone to, write the codes down, and no one ever did. And that was before the internet.
Happened a few times. I don't remember. Well, that about wraps it up for today's lovely episode, riffing on the past and saying goodbye to Prima Games official strategy guides, and the history of strategy guides in our lives.
I think you're right. Next time I go back to the States, I might have to pick up some used guides just cause,
Just cause. They're going to be hot. It's the new video game collector's item. They're going to be hot.
Yeah. Well, that's what the Bit War Veterans is all about. Just talking about the stuff that just isn't around anymore. It's just not the same anymore.
Sharing our stories and yours. And if you'd like to get in touch with us, you could always email us at bitwarveterans@gmail.com. Hook up with us on Twitter at bitwarvets.
And you could also follow me personally at meowteching, MEOWTECHING.
Where you can respond to the questions of the month and have your stories told on the podcast.
And we're going to plug our YouTube channel here. Oh!
If you'd like to see us, as well as
listen to us.
Listen to us.
We have faces.
We do have faces, and we also have some very funny content, very different from what we do here in the podcast.
Yes, we do some gaming skits, and we also have some really interesting items that we're finding here in Korea land.
Some of them we've talked about, like that Crystal Xbox.
And upcoming, we're going to show you a StarCraft board game. Whoa.
We're also going through and reviewing and previewing all the games on the Japanese edition of the Neo Geo Mini.
And we have a lot more in store for you, so give us a subscribe. You can find us at youtube.com/bitwarveterans.
Go watch now. You could also find a back catalog of podcasts
at bitwarveterans.libsyn.com, or you could search for us on iTunes or your favorite podcast player.
Which is probably how you're listening right now.
Right. So thanks for everyone for listening, for submitting ideas and sharing in this conversation. And if you've made it this far,
then you and we
are
Bit War Veterans!